Hello and welcome to the second video from my series on conflict management. My name is Ania Kolbuszewska and today we will look at what we can learn from metaphors which we use to talk about conflict. In the 1990s, Suzanne McCorkle and Janet Mills decided to look into how people use metaphors to talk about conflicts. In a study which they conducted, close to 350 respondents used over 600 metaphors, and all these metaphors described interpersonal conflicts that they were all involved in. And yes, you probably guessed it, these metaphors were mostly, though not exclusively, presenting conflict as a negative force. Just to give you some examples, a tornado, tied up in chains, in a time warp, buried in a hole, Cold War, Civil War, never-ending battle. When McCorkle and Mills published the result of their study, in the title of their publication, they actually used one of the metaphors which came up in their study, and that metaphor was rowboat in a hurricane. Metaphors are, of course, interesting in themselves, but they can also be a very valuable source of information. And it's a source of information about how we, but also how other people really feel about conflict. And having this information may help you use the right strategy to resolve a confrontation. So what kind of information does a metaphor give us? Well, to find out, we need to ask 5 questions. And to show you how this works, I'm going to use the example of the rowboat in a hurricane metaphor. So here come the 5 questions. Question number 1 is about the general nature of conflict in this metaphor. So remember, we're talking about the metaphor of being in conflict is like being in a rowboat in a hurricane. So the general nature of conflict in this metaphor will be that conflict is uncontrollable, often unpredictable, and it brings about severe devastation. The second and the third questions are about roles. So question number 2 is about the role of the person who uses the metaphor. Now, if you think that conflict is like being in a rowboat in a hurricane, that means that you feel completely helpless when faced with conflict. And question number 3, the role of the other side. In this metaphor, the other side is, of course, the hurricane. And a hurricane is an irresistible force. The next question is about power distribution. So how is power distributed in this metaphor? And of course, in our metaphor, all power lies on the other side. It's the hurricane that has all the power. And finally, question number 5, what conflict management strategies or tactics are the most logical consequence of this metaphor? And of course, if you feel that conflict is like being in a rowboat in a hurricane, the only logical consequence or the only logical strategy is to run and hide, because it's far better than confronting something that you simply cannot control. So in other words, if you think that conflict is like being in a rowboat in a hurricane, you feel completely powerless when faced with conflict. And chances are that you will try to avoid conflict at all costs, even if it means that your interests are not protected or are completely ignored. Now, it's your turn. Think about a conflict that you have recently been involved in, or a conflict that you remember well. What metaphor would you use to describe it? And most importantly, what does this metaphor tell you about how you really feel about conflict? Remember to ask the 5 questions about the general nature of conflict, the roles of both sides in conflict, about distribution of power, and finally about the most logical strategy or tactic. And I really hope that you'll enjoy this little trip of self-discovery. Next time, we'll look at goals in conflict and why it's so difficult sometimes to see what the other side really wants in a confrontation. Until then, thank you very much and see you.